Those of you that are able, please rise and the pledge of allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Brother Meadows, if you would come forward and present our invitation. Let's pray together. God, we come before you today, thanking you for who you are in our lives, thanking you for the way, God, that you have loved us. Time and time again in Scripture, your love has shown itself through sacrifice. If ever there were an American holiday that embodies sacrifice for fellow man, we celebrate that holiday today. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to be in space with so many who have sacrificed for people that they knew and even those that they did not. So God, we pray for your continued guidance and direction. We thank you for your hands of safety and for your providence of allowing them to be here. God, we pray for that to continue. This is your son's name we pray. Amen. Amen. Mr. Herb.
Welcome. We are welcome. We're glad to have you all with us today on this. It's a special day for those of us who happen to be veterans, and we really appreciate those of you who support your veterans. I want to make a couple of announcements before we do our dedication. We have chili dinner. It's going to be after. Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I keep moving. We have a chili dinner that's going to be after this service. And I want to make sure that you all know you're all welcome to come. You're welcome to come for that. I want to make sure that you feel welcome, and we're so glad that you're here. Now, Mr. Glenn Daggett, or Commander Glenn Daggett.
Thanks, Herb. Just a couple of acknowledgments. We have some VIPs here tonight. We have 3 surviving World War II individuals, Mr. Russ Harris, Mr. Hugh Breeden, and Mr. Frank Cherry. They couldn't be with us tonight. It was our plan to honor them. Were they able to, but they could not. Houston County Historical Society is here today. They are working on a program honoring World War II veterans, which will be held on August 13th, 2023 at the high school. They need your help in gathering information of over 1,300 World War II veterans who have ties to Houston County. Please stop by their table after the program and be sure the names of anyone who served during World War II is listed. I appreciate it. The World War I program was quite intense, and I have no reason to believe that this will be any different. As Mr. Gould said, there is a chili dinner after that everybody is invited to up at the Jimmy Ross Veterans Center. That's it for now. If you will.
It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. His name is Dewey Browder. I asked him one time, I said, would you prefer to be called Dr. Browder, Professor Browder, Colonel Browder? Because he has all of those titles. And he said, just call me Dewey. So Dewey has a long and I think a very illustrious career. He's an APSU Emeritus Professor, former Chair of the Department of History and Philosophy. He took the world's first picture of light coming from a laser when he was a young U.S. Army photographer in 1963. He would later serve in Vietnam, receiving 2 Bronze Stars for meritorious achievement. in ground operations against hostile forces, and subsequently in Europe, where he was the assistant principal advisor and speechwriter to the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army in Europe. And then he was the adjutant general for the U.S. Army Europe's forces in Italy, Greece, and Turkey. He earned the Legion of Merit twice during his service in Europe, and his final assignment before retiring in 1992 was as Professor Emeritus of European History at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, where he taught future leaders of the U.S. Army. I'm sorry I had to read that, but there's so much to Dewey's bio that I didn't want to miss anything. One thing that's not in there, we recently at Austin Peay State University developed a military Hall of Fame. And we have one member in this audience right now that's a member of that inaugural group, and that would be Dewey Browder. So thank God for him and his service to our country. And another fellow that was inaugurated that you may know is named O.S. Uffelman. He was also in that inaugural class at Austin Peay. So, Mr. Dewey, without further ado, I'm going to ask you to come up and talk to us.
Can we make that microphone work?
Yeah, you have to hold it real close.
Okay, well, can you hear me okay? I think so, yeah. So Herb and I are compatriots with the Sons of the American Revolution in Clarksville, and that's how I know Herb. He's our chaplain and a very prominent member of our chapter. I have to tell you, I'm impressed with this audience. He said we can have perhaps as many as 100 people. Well, I'm a farm boy from Missouri, and the nearest town to me was a place called Tightwad. Tightwad, Missouri. Population of 32. So we've got more people in the audience than I think we had in our whole town in the 1950s in Tightwad. So this is my second presentation in as many days. I spoke to a group on campus at Austin Peay last night and talked about the last casualty of the Cold War. And I drew on my experiences as the military political advisor to the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Army Europe for that. And tonight I'm going to be speaking with the Cumberland Winds, and then on Monday I'm going to be talking about the end of the Cold War with the Veterans Home in Clarksville. So it's a busy time. Okay, let me see if I can make the thing work here. Can you see that, or do we need to dim lights? Everybody can see it okay?
Yes. So you all right?
So let me make just a couple of preliminary remarks to kind of set the stage for our presentation today. I ask you to go back to the beginning of the 20th century and take a look at Europe for just a couple of minutes, because Europe was really a series of armed camps in early 20th century Europe. The Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente were faced off against each other. The Triple Alliance was the French and the British and the Russians, and the Triple Entente was the Germans, the Austrians, and the Italians. Now, the Italians did not step up and honor their treaty with the other members of their Entente. When the war started, they held back, and they later negotiated a secret agreement with Austria, and that was if they joined forces with Austria, or joined forces with Russia and France and England against Austria, they would get territory from Austria. So armed camps, Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. All across Europe at that time, nationalism was really, really blossoming. Everybody felt the spirit of nationalism, and nowhere was it any stronger than in the little area called Serbia. And Serbia had recently been annexed by Austria. And on June the 28th of 1914, a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip assassinated Francis Ferdinand. It's kind of an old story. I think you're probably familiar with it. But That triggered the war. This was the event that started the war. And so if you look at the screen up here for a minute, on July the 28th, Austria declared war on Serbia. Serbia had killed their Francis Ferdinand. And on August the 1st, Germany declared war on Russia because Russia had a defensive alliance with Serbia. And then on August the 3rd, Germany declared war on France because it was included in what was called the Schlieffen Plan, and I'll give you some description of that here in just a couple of minutes. And then on August the 4th, Britain declared war on Germany because Germany had violated the neutral state of Belgium, which had been promised eternal sovereignty since 1839. So it was really and truly a hectic time. So I mentioned the Schlieffen Plan. This was the grand strategic idea that Germany had, and had been developed by their chief of staff, a man by the name of von Schlieffen. He had retired in 1906 and handed it over to Helmut von Moltke, and Helmut von Moltke was the nephew of the great Helmut von Moltke of the 18th century wars, or the 19th century wars. So this plan, if you look at the map, called for Germans to invade, and they were originally going to go through the Netherlands and through Belgium and come up and scoop up the French forces and press them right up against hard defensive positions along the German border and crush them. And then as soon as they finished off the French, they were going to turn the full force of their operations against Russia in the east. So that was the actual Schlieffen Plan. Well, when the war first broke out, von Moltke detached some troops from the German Reich, which is facing over against France, and sent them to the Eastern Front. And they made quick work of the Russians for a while in battles, but it weakened their line up and down the western border with France and Belgium and the Netherlands. So von Moltke was displaced and replaced by a man by the name of Falkenhayn, and he changed the operations. He said, we're going to go back to this original plan, and we're going to finish up the French first. And so he built up all the forces he could, and then launched a major battle, the Battle of the Marne, in early September of 1914, and it failed. They were stymied. And so they did not violate the territory of the Netherlands because they wanted to keep that open for trade, so Germany could still trade with the world at large and ship things back and forth through the Netherlands. But Belgium had been violated, and Belgium was occupied by German forces. That Battle of the Marne in early September of 1914 was a failure. And so in order to try to overcome the stalemate on the Western Front, the Germans tried to outflank the French on the north. The French tried to outflank the Germans to the north, and it was called the March to the Sea. They just kept trying to outflank each other until they were totally lined up against one another from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. And so that line you see down there through the middle, that was the armed line, and they had dug in. They had dug into trenches. I mean, the trenches were deep. They were an average of about 10 feet deep. And they were zigzag, so that if an enemy broke into your trench, they couldn't shoot up and down the trench line. They would just be able to shoot for a few yards, and then there would be a rampart back and forth that way. And there were trenches all the way. Some of these individual trenches were about a mile long, but then they joined up and they interfaced and linked up with one another. And so that was the situation by the end of September in 1914. Prominent in this trench system was the front line trench. And the Germans had trenches and the French had trenches. And they were lined up sometimes as close as 30 meters apart from here to the back of the room. You could hear people talking in the other trench. Of course, they were speaking German over there, and they were speaking French over here, but nevertheless, they could basically understand them. Look at that picture on the screen for a minute. To that guy's right, you'll notice that there's kind of a platform. That was a step platform for them to stand up on, and then they could fire the machine guns and fire against the enemy. And if you put your head above that, you were in danger of being shot. I mean, sometimes those people were only 30 meters away or 100 meters away. Sometimes it's a quarter of a mile, but there was a real danger. In order to facilitate observing the other side, they erected mirrors on the backside so they could sit on that trench and watch the mirror and see if there were enemy forces coming up from behind them. And they also used periscopes so that they didn't have to stick their head up. They could kind of. So this is a real stalemate. That frontline trench, it was ugly in there, and it was ugly everywhere. It rained, particularly in the northern part of the battlefield, getting up close to the English Channel. And they were very close to the water table, so the water was seeping in to the trenches from the bottom, and of course it rained a lot. And then when they were shelled with artillery, it would cause those trench walls to cave in and crumble, and those would have to be cleaned up. And it was a mess. And then right in front of that front line, typically they had observation posts out maybe 100 yards in the front. And there was a connecting trench that went from that main line trench up to the observation points. And those places were manned by teams of 2 or 3 soldiers at a time. And they would stay there for 2 or 3 hours at a time, and then they would be relieved, and there would be a fresh crew that would come in behind them. Now, those forward positions were really vulnerable, particularly when the other side started sending out. And when they talked about going over the top, it meant going over that ridge or over that trench line and heading towards the enemy. And we see that characterized in the movies and in the novels and so forth as a massive charge. And there were a lot of those. But more often than not, going over the top meant that you were going out on patrol. And if you were going out on patrol and you were really close to the enemy, you went out on your belly. And I can remember reading accounts of soldiers who were crawling and they encountered enemy from the other side coming to do the same thing. So everybody went with a knife in their hand. For encountering enemies in that so-called no man's land. Well, behind this line, that main line that we're looking at here, there was a support line. And that support line was usually about 100 to maybe 200 yards to the rear. And there were connecting trenches that tied those together. And then farther behind the support line was a reinforcing line, where they also had the medical stations, so that when you got shot, you got injured, they could get you back to medical care, or they could bring. And it normally took at least 4 soldiers to evacuate a single enemy or a single wounded soldier because of the mud. I mean, the mud was absolutely horrible. You may not be able to see that because of the light, but that's a dugout, a German dugout. Back behind that support line, there were usually dugouts where the officers and the senior people stayed. Can you get those lights? Work on it. Where the more senior officers stayed, and they were typically 30 feet underground, and they were connected by trenches. They had a place where they could sleep. They had a place where they could wash up a little bit. Latrines were something different. I don't know. I've got a picture in here. Let's see if it's the next one. I'll get to it in a minute. Mud everywhere. No matter where you went, there was mud. Soldiers even drowned in those trenches. Sometimes they were so wet and miserable. And when they weren't up on the front line firing and weren't on duty somewhere else, they had to reinforce those trench lines. They had to dig out the mud. They had to, and in the sides of the walls of those trenches, they were called funk holes. A little cave-like thing was dug in there where they slept. And they would cover up with a tarpaulin or something that would keep them dry as they possibly could. So you can imagine this is really and truly crowded at all times, and mud was ever present. One of the biggest problems was trench foot. everybody was subject to this. And officers conducted daily inspections of their soldiers' feet to see whether or not they had trench foot. And the typical treatment was bathing them with opium and I forgot some kind of a mineral that went along with it. And they had to be dry, they had to be evacuated, and just imagine that happening to your foot. I mean, just a terrible, terrible. About 50% of the casualties on the front, though, came from a lack of hygiene. It wasn't so much from the shooting and the killing with weapons, but from the conditions. The front lines were fronted by concertina wire. Those were typically at least 15 meters deep, and I don't have a picture of it, but they had 5-foot iron stakes that were like screws, and they could screw them into the ground and attach the concertina wire to it. They were pointed on the top. I have 4 of those at home. I use for tomato sticks today as a sort of a souvenir or a remembrance of World War I. That wire would get damaged by artillery fire and by machine gun fire and had to be replaced periodically, normally 2 or 3 times a week. They would send out teams and they would go out at night and replace the concertina wire. They couldn't use flashlights. They couldn't, they had to do it, kind of groping. And oftentimes they would encounter the other side replacing their concertina wire at the same time. And so they pretended they didn't see each other, but they kept an eye. Because if you shot, I'll catch you in just a second, if you shot their guys, your guys were going to get shot immediately. So they went ahead and reinforced that concertina wire pretty much at night. Yes, ma'am. You have a question?
Oh.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to know what the difference was between concertina wire and barbed wire.
It is barbed wire, but it's rolled.
Oh.
It's rolled and spread around. We used it in Vietnam. We had concertina wire in Vietnam, and we were there, and certainly with the infantry or in the field units, you know what I'm talking about. So the concertina wire was in front of your foot position, and it was in front of the enemy's position. And if you went over the top, you had to work your way through that, not only your own concertina wire, but the enemy's concertina wire. So typically going over the top in battle, I'm not talking about the patrols now, you would be preceded by rolling artillery fire. And the artillery was back several hundred yards behind the positions that I had described to you already. And the artillery would blow holes in the concertina wire, people could work their way through. And of course they would aim at the enemy's concertina wires also. So concertina wire was forever a problem. Evacuating the wounded, I mentioned that to you earlier. It took typically 4 men to evacuate a single person who couldn't move on his own. And because they were working through that deep mud and water all the time. Christmas trees. This is a famous truce. Perhaps you've heard about it in Christmas 1914. The British soldiers heard the German soldiers singing Christmas carols. And so the British soldiers started singing Christmas carols. And the Germans responded. And they put up white flags. And they went out and met each other and they sang Christmas carols together on Christmas Eve, 1914. And when the senior commanders on both sides heard about it, they worried that it was going to destroy the fighting spirit. But that Christmas truce was famous. They even got a football game going in one place where the Germans played against the British. And by that time, the British had gotten onto the battlefield. So, and there were some other things that were incongruous. For example, a lot of places, by mutual agreement, they would declare a no-fire period for breakfast. So everybody could eat their breakfast in peace and quiet. But there was mutual agreement. From 7 o'clock until 9 o'clock, we won't shoot at you and you don't shoot at us. And so, in spite of all of the difficulties that they had with hygiene and nutrition, and I'll say something about food a little bit later on, one of the unique things was that there was a very, very rare instance of common colds or pneumonia. even in the winter, when people are wringing wet with sweat, freezing their feet and trench foot, somehow the common cold and pneumonia wasn't a real problem. Okay, I made a reference to latrines a few minutes earlier. Here's one that illustrates what's going on. Everywhere you have soldiers, you have to have facilities. And of course, they were just holes in the ground, typically about 5 or 6 feet deep, with a wooden bench for them to rest themselves on. When they're filled up, they covered them over and dug new ones. And oftentimes they used artillery shells where artillery had blown up, blown holes in the ground, and they used those as latrines. Now, every time I see that picture, I have to think about an experience I had in Vietnam. In 1970, we had a major operation called Lam Son 719 going on right up next to the North Vietnamese border. And I was with the Da Nang Support Command, and we were providing the logistics support. And one morning, I was the Secretary of the General Staff, and one morning the Chief of Staff said, "Dewey, you and I are going to go up to the front today. You're going to have to tell your grandkids someday what you did during the war, and I want you to make sure you get at least this experience." Well, I'd already had my experience with the 4th Infantry Division, but I went with him. We went up there, and he made a point of talking to the local commanders. How's your logistics? Are you getting all the ammo you need? What about your food? What about petroleum? What about anything they possibly need? And we were taking a tour around the area, and we came up on a guy who was on a straddle of a trench. And Colonel Conrad, the Chief of Staff, turned to one of the guys in the party that was escorting us and said, "You've got a camera, take a picture of that man." And the guy said, "What on earth for?" And Colonel Conrad said, "He's the only guy who knows what he's doing." So we got that picture, and then after we got back to the office back down in Da Nang, he decided he wanted to know who that guy was, and so we had a search going on trying to figure out who this soldier was up on the front, so to speak, against the North Vietnamese. But the latrines were absolutely everywhere. There's an example of going over the top, and I told you that going over the top typically meant going out on patrol. And sometimes you were on your stomach carrying a bad end in case you ran into somebody from the other side. Okay, so much for about kind of life in the trenches. So let's talk about the fighting itself. Probably the principal weapon was the Maxim machine gun. Now, that's when it was invented in 1888, as I recall. But both sides had them, and they had them everywhere. Where I showed you that slide of the trench and the firing front and so forth. Probably every 15 or 20 yards there was a machine gun. And then there were also people with their rifles. So the machine gun was it was a blessing if you were shooting it, and it was a curse if the other guy was shooting it. The Maxim machine gun really took its toll, and of course it tore up the concertina wire too when you fired through the concertina wire at the enemy. Artillery was really, really important, and it was a little bit behind the front lines, typically maybe a quarter of a mile or a half mile back, or sometimes even further back. And they were pretty good at plotting their fires. They were pretty accurate with their artillery. The British said that on the Western Front at the end of the war, they had fired 170 million artillery rounds. We don't have an exact count, but it's about that. And the French said we're close. So, I mean, during a fight within a company-sized area, every minute there would be 20 or 30 artillery rounds landing in there. So, I mean, this is just absolutely death. The artillery was just devastating. Then in 1916, the British introduced a new weapon. It's the tank. And you may already know this, but the reason it's called a tank is because when they were developing it, it was a secret weapon, and they told everybody, and this was being done in England, they told everybody, we're building watering tanks for cattle. They had the spackle going, and they were calling them lots of them, and so they just referred to them as tanks. So the British introduced that in 1916, and it only went about 2 or 3 miles an hour, but that's about a walking pace to to accompany advancing infantry. The Germans very soon had their own tanks, the French had their own tanks. But the tank was another deadly and devastating weapon. Okay, as far as actual operations is concerned, both sides depended too heavily on old aristocratic officers. And they had studied the Battle of Waterloo and 19th century Napoleon campaigns and so forth. And the British, this one British officer said the most important thing in battle, is boldness on the offense. You need to charge. And so they locked themselves in on both sides into this idea that when you're going to take out the enemy, you do go over the top en masse, and you do charge, and you fight tooth and nail, and you've got to be bold, you've got to be daring. So that was sort of the predominant philosophy on both sides. America tried to stay out of World War I. In 1915, the Germans were torpedoing incoming or any ships doing trade with England, trying to cut off their war supplies. And in May of 1915, they sank a ship called the Lusitania, and there were a lot of Americans on board. 128 lost their life when that ship went down. And America immediately told the Germans, cease and desist, or we're coming in. So the Germans agreed that they would cancel the torpedoing of ships coming and going. They would take out more ships. They waited a little more than a year, and finally, in the beginning of 1917, they started it again. And when they started it up again, Woodrow Wilson, the president, asked Congress for a declaration of war. He got it on the 2nd of April in 1917. And America was by no means ready to go to war. They had an awful lot to do. But by the end of May, so a little more than a month, by the end of May, they already had American Marines and American soldiers in France being integrated into the Allied defense policies. And the senior, there's Woodrow Wilson, the man that asked for the declaration of war, he got it. The senior American commander was General Black Jack Pershing. I know you've heard his name. He got the nickname Black Jack because he had commanded black troops in the Indian War. He graduated from West Point in 1986, I think. And so as a lieutenant, he was sent out to the plains and commanded the 10th Cavalry, which was an all-black unit. He was the senior American commander. And he said, I'm not going to have American soldiers fighting in French and British units. The French and the British want to say, okay, give us replacements and we'll put them in this squad and that squad and so forth. Black Jack said, no, they're going to fight under the American flag. I'm okay with integrating them at the largest level. In other words, having a corps commanded by a French or a British, but the individual brigades, American brigades, are going to be commanded by Americans, and they're going to be staffed only with Americans. And he got his way, with the exception of 4 black brigades that he authorized to be integrated with the French. But other than that, they were fighting under American command. Okay, so the first major engagement was Belleau Wood. And first major engagement, and this was the end of May, so they haven't even been there really a month yet until they're engaged. And they were Marines that were engaged first of all. And there was an overall French commander, and he told the American commanders that they needed to dig in and dig trenches. And they said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to. So America was inheriting this trench warfare that had predominated all up until then. And so the Americans just dug shallow trenches, foxholes if that's what you want to call them, and then they would get out of them, and then they would charge the enemy. And they won. And they gave the French confidence in the Americans' ability to fight. There was some skepticism in the beginning, obviously. When the French told the Americans they had to retreat, the American response was, "Retreat, hell, we just got here." And so they had said they were breaking away from the mold, staying in the trenches and living in the trenches. And on one occasion, a Marine Corps first sergeant led the charge and told them, and the guys didn't want to get out of their foxholes, and he said, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" That's a famous quote that lives on to this day from that Marine Corps master sergeant. And the Americans proved dominant. And the Belleau Wood, later on, the French changed the name of it to the Wood of the Marines. And Black Jack Pershing later wrote about it, said this was the most significant engagement American soldiers had made since the Civil War. And of course, he was right. Okay, the Americans broke the mold by refusing to fight from the trenches or stay in the trenches. They were in the trenches, but they got out. They carried the battle to the enemy. And here's a look at just some statistics for you in a summary fashion. On the Western Front, Germany had 2,037,000 soldiers that lost their life in battle. France had 1,397,800. Great Britain 1,118,264. The total dead amounted to getting close to 5 million. That includes some Americans. Total casualties in the war, now that's the Eastern Front and Western Front combined. Dead military, 10 million. Dead civilians, 10 million. Wounded, 20 million. Now you get different counts on what sources you use, whether or not you're looking at German sources or French or Russian or American. But those are easy figures to work with, and they're all fairly close to one another. So we get our Veterans Day, and I want to wish everybody a happy Veterans Day, but we get that as a consequence of this war, First World War. And it was celebrated, and then it was intensified after World War II and became prominent again. And then in 1952, President Eisenhower sponsored it, so to speak, have made a national holiday, declared a national holiday in 1952. And so we've been celebrating it ever since. So it came from World War I, we continue to honor it, and I will be happy to try to answer any questions you might have now. Thank you for your attention. Who's taking over up here now?
For me, for now.
Billy, I've got one question for you.
Okay.
Why in the world did they see the wisdom of fighting in the trenches? What good did they gain?
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
It was sort of a decision of the moment. What can we do right now? They didn't want to retreat. They didn't want to charge forward anymore because they knew it was going to be dead. And so both sides started to dig in. And once they started to dig in, they found it hard to get out. And they were committed to that old line business about boldness on the offense is the most important part of warfare. And they just stayed there until the Americans came along and kind of changed the tune for that. Does that answer the question?
Yes, sir. Sure.
All right, I appreciate that.
Thanks again.
Thank you, sir.
Very well. I enjoyed it.
At this time, if Mr. Gould will go forward, every year we honor those veterans that have passed on since last Veterans Day. With the toning of the bell, the reading of the name and the toning of the bell. And at this time, I'll ask Mr. Gould if he will do the reading, and I will do the toning.
Thank you, Glenn. Just for you all's information, we also do this every month at our VFW meeting and at our American Legion meeting. We told them about vets that had passed away in the last month. This will be those that have passed away in the last year. And it starts with Veterans Day and goes to Veterans Day. John Wesley Grable Sr., U.S. Army. John Robert Walker, U.S. Navy. Gregory Addington, U.S. Army. John Wayne Carson, U.S. Navy. Walter Richard Volb, U.S. Air Force. Robert Tilton Tomlinson, U.S. Army. Richard Franklin Gear, U.S. Army. Walter Carl Cullister, U.S. Army. Andrew Wayne Andy Hale, U.S. Air Force. Anton Ungenheim, I think that's pronounced. I'll have to get that straight. U.S. Air Force. Anyone know how that name's pronounced? Ungentein, yes, that's right. His wife was a teacher at the elementary school. Ungentein, okay. Anton Ungentein. K. Francis Hudson, U.S. Navy. Barry Dean Jones, U.S. Navy. Frankie Brown Preston, U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force. John Delton Cook, U.S. Air Force. Fred Lonnie Wilson, U.S. Navy. Donald Wayne Register, U.S. Army. Betty Jean Wyatt, U.S. Air Force. If you're able, would you please stand and we'll have a moment of silence for these veterans who passed in the last year. Thank you very much.
At this time, if the American Legion Honor Guard will proceed outside, we shall fire Wallach in honor of our fallen comrades, as well as Ms. Lula will play taps. Those of you who are able, please stand.
This completes our Veterans Day service. I want to thank all of you for coming and for paying respect to those veterans that we have. Thank Colonel Dewey once again. And that'll be it. Please come and eat chili with us. I don't know what the